Well, we are rounding the corner, so to speak, in this series on building community. After about 2 weeks of talking about different kinds of barriers to building community, we're going to switch gears, so to speak. We're going to look at a powerful tool to build community, and that is accountability. Now, when it comes to accountability, many people treat it like the plague. Take the mask mandate, for instance. In certain countries, this was a big issue. And to a lesser extent here in Hong Kong. Maybe that was a hangover from SARS. We have memories of that collectively. And so the adoption of masks were easier, but there are still some who refuse. Some who flaunted the ordinance, and save for maybe a bit of crowd shaming of maybe some dirty looks going your way, there was little enforcement. But that's probably the form of accountability that we would generally think about. The kind that would be police enforcement or societal enforcement, whatever it may be that we may or may not want to do. Now, certainly there's some other kinds of accountability. Those, do you remember those tests and exams back in school? Or any certification or licensing process, like the driving tests, perhaps, or becoming board certified or a licensed professional in a certain career. In fact, all of those are forms of accountability. And for the most part, we're glad that some sort of accountability is in place. Every one of us who would ever need to go under the knife would want to know that our anesthesiologists and the surgical team, they are well-trained and their experiences are all up to par. Same for airline pilots. We probably don't think about it until the next time we're sitting down and we click on our seatbelts. But when that flight becomes unexpectedly bumpy, or that harrowing landing happens, well, then we can only hope and pray that the pilot was above board and he didn't take any shortcuts in their training. But then when it comes to us, ourselves, most of us feel a little bit allergic to the notion of accountability, as if it was an intrusion into our privacy, an assault on our sense of autonomy, an infringement on our rights. Now, I purposely painted this in very, very heavy and broad strokes. And so I'm probably not describing anyone here or those of you joining us online. But perhaps there are some of you who could relate to some of these feelings. Now, I knew I used to have such similar attitudes towards accountability. See, there was a time where accountability was truly a bad word in my mind. Now, chalk it up to maybe youthful insolence or thinking that as a young person I knew the best, and there was no one who could tell me what I didn't already know. And so I would foolishly refuse the advice and the guidance of my elders. And in this case, it was one of my former bosses. And this was my first job out of university. So, fresh grad, thinking I've got everything I need to succeed. And I had my first chance to manage a summer intern. And I refused all of the help and advice of my boss. And, well, long story short, this summer intern basically became a rogue agent. She did whatever she wanted, and it just got into a huge circus of a mess. And thankfully, the only thing that I can look back on that time and be glad about was nobody in the department was embarrassed and nobody got fired, myself included. But after that experience, my thoughts and attitudes toward accountability began to change when I realized that without accountability, chaos really would reign. For accountability, for community, in building community, we're actually given this double gift of accountability and consistency. Accountability is actually a gift. It's actually a good thing. It really is. And after my workplace experience, I began to shift in my thinking about accountability. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul had used this illustration of the body comprised of many, many parts, yet forming one body. And in this illustration, he compares the church similarly. And he says, just as the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you, neither can we divide one another and render others as null and void. Now, I know you're sitting there wondering, well, how is this passage related to accountability? You might be wondering this. Simply put, in order for the body to function properly, in order for every part must be doing its own job. If your colon, for example, decides to take a day off, feeling heavy will be the least of your problems. If you're walking along the street and your eyes decide, I'm really tired, I'm just going to close my eyes and take a nap, your feet might want to think, hey, I can help. But any step you take is not going to be a step in the good and right direction, right? Your feet cannot do the job of your eyes. Your body relies on each other and every part for its survival, and so too does the local church. We each are designed, planned, and purposed, equipped with different gifts and talents. These are necessary for not only the survival of this local body, but for the thriving of the local church. And so we all have a part to play, and while there are many parts, the noble and the ignoble roles, they remain just as vital and important. And accountability, it becomes a gift that ensures that each member is functioning properly. Now, in the passage that Isabella had just read, I want to focus on the last two verses here. Now, you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. And God has placed in the church, first of all, apostles, second, prophets, third, teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, of helping, of guidance, and of different kinds of tongues. In that larger part of this passage, we're reminded that you and I, we are the body of Christ. Each of us has his role, has his part to play. Each of us are a part of the church. And yes, you can certainly make the argument that this passage, it's talking about the church stretching throughout time and space, which is the original intention, the original definition of Catholic. That's the word used in the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed is a creedal statement of faith that actually predates the Protestant Reformation. So before there was a Catholic and Protestant church separation. In fact, it predates the Great Schism. So you go back even further in time where it was the break between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Church. The Apostles' Creed predates all of that. So that word, Catholic, is not a denominational, a grouping sort of thing. It's talking about the church throughout time and space. But we don't even need to get into those theological weeds. And this separation and defining of various different groupings of churches and denominations. Well, surprise, that is the exact opposite of what this passage is trying to get at. In fact, that sort of separation is doing what the enemy's job of dividing us is doing. Indeed, even the determining who's in and who's out, that is God's role, not any one of ours. Jesus even gives us a parable to kind of highlight this. This is Matthew chapter 13. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sows good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and he sowed weeds among the wheat, and then he went away. When the weeds sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants, they came to him and they said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your fields? Where then did these weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first, collect the weeds and tie them in bundles and to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring them into my barn. Now, you'd think that Jesus would advocate a clean house, order, exercise extreme measures to rid the field of the weeds. But what does the master tell the servant here? Leave them alone. If you pull them out, you might actually cause damage to the wheat, to the good stuff. So instead, just be patient. Wait until harvest time. And by the way, that is the time that the judge, Jesus, will come and separate the wheat and from the chaff, the sheep and the goats, the good and the bad. Anyway, this parable, is amazingly gracious. It's an amazingly gracious way of dealing with a very complicated matter. And let's face it, anytime you have to deal with have human beings, which, by the way, that is the purest form of political. Anytime it gets political with human beings, it is complicated. And here Jesus wisely reminds his people, don't do anything rash. Rather, trust God. Trust that God will have it in control. In his timing, in his perfect plan, it'll work out correctly. Okay, so if we are one body and not have to worry about divisions and all these kind of things, just like our own physical body, we depend on each other to do its job. So then, we should know and be aware of any sort of misalignment or dysfunction or malfunction. And so that's where this whole concept of accountability begins to be a help. See, there must be some way of detecting this so that the problem can be addressed. Come back to our own bodies. We are encouraged to pay attention to our own bodies, to our health, to know and to recognize when something happens, something occurs out of the ordinary. Maybe an unusual bump, or a consistent recurring pain, or a rash, or a restricted movement of some sort. It could be a sign that your body is trying to convey to you that you need to seek help. You need to see a doctor. That's, in a sense, accountability. You see, just like we need to know what is normal, what is our body's standard operating parameters, so to speak, so that you need to know and recognize that something is off. Accountability is absolutely useless unless we have a similar awareness and understanding. Now, this is crucial not just in making accountability work, it's the essence of true friendship. This is the necessary factor in making any relationship be meaningful and worthwhile. Certainly true in marriage, as well as any relationship that we deem important and precious. Can you imagine? It's probably the most terrible, worst betrayal to admit one day that your friend, the person that you thought you knew so well, that you would ever have to admit that I guess I never really knew him or her. This is a quote from Justin Cronin. To know and be known, that is the final desire, the heart of love. Now this quote, I think it speaks to the heart of the gospel. Just why did Jesus come for us and die on the cross? This is a core theological tenet, and major theses have been written on this, but it all points back to one key motivation. Jesus came because of God's love for us. We're made for relationship with one another, yes, but primarily with God. Now, does God need to be in relationship with us? No, not in the same way that we would think. Not in the same way that we think about relationship, not in this to know and to be known sort of way. God doesn't need that because remember, the Trinity is the perfect community. There's nothing lacking in God. Rather, out of God's love, springing a motivation to share his love with his children, he came. He sent the Son. And so when Adam and Eve were cast out of Eden, after their willful act of disobedience and mistrust of God, God's love motivated Jesus to come and to rescue and to restore us, to rescue us from death and restore us from what sin stole, from what sin destroyed. And he does that through community. So then how does accountability and consistency help build community? Intrinsic in accountability is the need for vulnerability and transparency. Put it another way, accountability requires us to be real with one another and to be real with ourselves. Is a part of why so many of us feel hesitant when it comes to accountability is that we simply don't like anyone telling us what we can or can't do, or to hold us to our word when it comes to our promises. But in true biblical accountability, it becomes a gift to us. When accountability is welcomed, it becomes a gift because it can help us to achieve the goals that are important to us. It's not an intrusion. It's an invitation to have someone help us with accountability. It means having someone who is offering a hand to pull you up. It means someone who you can turn to if your own willpower or resolve is running out. I would even go so far as to say that when our faith in ourselves falls short, it is an invitation to rely on others' faith in us. Are you beginning to see how incredible this actually is? It's not combative, it's collaborative. But how do you get there? How do we move to that? Especially if you've been hurt or betrayed in the past. Let me give you a behind-the-scenes look at how I look at this from a pastor's perspective. Now, you might think I love holding people accountable. Actually, nothing could be further from the truth. It takes effort to do that. And not only that, it takes a certain amount of not just courage, but thick skin. Because inevitably, you'll probably get some pushback or defensiveness or even attacked in the course of helping others with accountability. And to be honest, it's a whole lot easier to just keep my mouth shut and not say anything, to don't point out what is wrong or how something should or could be. And so this idea of accountability, with this, I began to develop a certain criteria in order to ascertain whether I was in an accountability situation. Put it another way, I would have to figure out, was I in a pastoral relationship with this other person? Now, this I started thinking about with the first church I was at, and so fresh, for this time, not fresh out of school, but fresh out of seminary, I was called to be the English pastor of a Chinese church in California. And so there I was introduced, and many people, they would use my title, pastor, to introduce, to call on to me. And so some people, they would be more on the formal side, they would call me Pastor Mui. Others would say Pastor Henry. Those who are even more formal would say Reverend Mui. And others who are less formal would say Henry. And to be honest, whatever they called me was fine. I didn't really have a mind which way or another. The main thing that I needed to figure out in those conversations was what kind of pastoral relationship was this? Because quickly on, what I learned was not everyone who calls me pastor expects me to function as their pastor. And accountability becomes a very important piece in this, because there's two things that I realized needed to be here. Let me jump right to those two questions that I would ask of myself. Has this person given me the privilege to speak truth personally into his or her life? I needed to have that as an understanding. It's in a sense, permission given, right? It needs to be something that's welcomed. And then the second question was, has this person intentionally made the effort to let me into their lives? This goes back to the other quote about to know and to be known. Because if these two things aren't there, this is problematic, and it's just a pleasantry to call me by my title. It's not an invitation to be pastoral. Even that concept, that word, where does this word pastor come from? Well, those of you who ever looked into the etymology of this word, it comes from shepherding. And so there's a strong connection of pastor and shepherd. Shepherding. Anybody here actual shepherds? I've seen sheep. I've never been very up close to sheep, except at the zoo. I wouldn't know how to take care of an actual sheep. But the inferences are so strong of feeding, of grooming, of protecting those primary roles of a shepherd. A pastor is supposed to function, is supposed to be doing. A shepherd is not a shepherd if he or she is not doing those things. And a pastor is not a pastor if they are not likewise. They aren't a pastor. They may be a communicator. They may be a teacher or a motivational speaker or a coach. But a pastor must shepherd. And so the question that I would ask myself is, are they sheep placed under my care? And so these two questions began to be very, very helpful in figuring out, am I being invited into this as well? Because it's a dual sort of thing. Is an invitation happening where relationship can progress beyond pleasantries? And so in order for that to happen, access must be given, meaning that I must be in that person's life as well enough to actually know what's going on, so that I could speak truth. This is indeed why God set up the local church. With technology, we can learn and sit under many gifted teachers and preachers, but none of them could possibly be your pastor simply because they don't know you. Oh, you might know a lot about them, your favorite online preacher. You might know their greatest hits, their favorite stories to tell you. But you don't also really know them. You don't know what they're like at home, in the private moments, in the human moments. And even more importantly, they don't know you in your home. They could not know your personality or your challenges, the specifics of your situation. And that is the crux of doing life together. In order to be someone's pastor, in order to be pastored, you and I must allow ourselves to be known. Now that's from my perspective, but this is applicable for each and every one of us. The criteria of accountability is these two things, permission and access. Without either one of these things, you can't have genuine accountability. You definitely won't have biblical accountability. And that biblical accountability of welcomed help in times of need. And this is a provision. Because for us as a church, it's not the expectation is that one pastor would handle all of the shepherding, all of the accountability. Can you imagine what that would actually look like? I wouldn't have time to do anything else. Forget about preaching. I have to meet with each person and to get to know and to pray and to counsel and to feed and to groom and to protect. it's just not feasible. It's not possible. Rather, in God's wisdom, He's appointed others. The Bible calls them church elders in the modern context. But accountability can be handled in a variety of different situations. All it takes is a trusted and valued relationship. When you have permission to speak truth into someone's life, and they give you access to their lives, and it would be a mutual way of doing that. If you have this in place, now you have the recipe for good and godly accountability. Now, the title of this sermon is The Gift of Accountability and Consistency. And I hadn't really gotten to that part, but here's where I would pull that all together. Because the way do you get to biblical accountability that's a help and that will help us grow in community as well as in our own discipleship walk, it's consistency. Be consistent in meeting together. Be consistent in being present in one another's lives. Now that means being in those big events in life, like birthdays and anniversaries, weddings, as well as the daily, regular, little things in life. The normal after-church lunch, or something else throughout the week. That's how you will amass those 200 hours needed to develop a close friendship. I want to close with one more passage. It's a short one, but it's very packed with practical wisdom. Colossians 3:16 says, "Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, from the Spirit, singing to the God with gratitude in your hearts." This is a beautiful picture of how accountability works in a biblical framework. It's the message of Christ. This is the gospel. This is the transformative power of God's love poured out through Jesus onto us. So let that message dwell in you richly. And by the way, that you is a plural. It's a second person plural. So it's just not each one of us individually. It's you all. We all. And so as you teach, as you admonish is a prettier word for accountability. As you admonish one another with all wisdom, praising God, worshiping, do it with gratitude in your hearts. Would you stand and join me in prayer?